Sadie Harper never imagined that the abandoned briefcase on a dirty Chicago street corner could change the course of her life. But there, between contracts signed by powerful men and secrets buried in the shadows of the corporate world, lay the destiny she had never sought. A homeless teenager, invisible to society, she held in her hands something far bigger than she could comprehend. The signature on those papers belonged to Samuel Hayes, an untouchable real estate mogul whose influence spread across the city. Sadie had two choices: return the documents and continue fading into the streets, or use that unexpected treasure as the key to unraveling the mystery that had haunted her since childhood. Who was her biological father? But she had no idea what kind of enemies she was about to attract. What began as a simple coincidence quickly spiraled into a web of lies, betrayals, and shocking truths that threatened to destroy everything and everyone around her. As Samuel's past starts to reveal itself as dark as Sadie's present, they realize they are more connected than they ever could have imagined. The only question that remains is, how far will they go to survive and uncover the whole truth? It was early evening, the dim light of the setting sun casting a pale glow over the alleyways of downtown Chicago. Sadie Harper, a 17-year-old who had spent the last few months without a proper roof over her head, walked aimlessly. She moved with the quiet grace of someone used to being unnoticed, her hoodie pulled over her unwashed hair, her eyes darting from shadow to shadow. She had learned that the world didn't care about people like her. But today, something felt different. There was a hum in the air, a sense that maybe, just maybe, her luck was about to change. She rounded a corner, her footsteps soft against the cracked pavement. Her attention flickered toward a dark, narrow alley ahead, a place she often used as a shortcut. That's when she saw it, a small, inconspicuous black leather briefcase leaning against the wall. Abandoned. Sadie's heart skipped a beat, her instinct screaming at her to keep walking. But hunger and desperation have a way of silencing caution. She looked around. The streets were quiet, unusually so. Not a single soul in sight. "What the hell?" she muttered under her breath, taking a step closer. Her fingers itched with curiosity, and before she could stop herself, she reached out, grabbing the handle of the briefcase. It was heavier than expected, the weight sending a surge of adrenaline through her veins. This was no ordinary piece of luggage. Sadie hurried to a secluded spot behind an old, rusted dumpster, crouching low. She flicked open the clasps with trembling fingers, her pulse quickening. The briefcase snapped open, revealing something she hadn't anticipated. Neatly stacked folders, bursting with contracts, legal papers, and real estate documents. At the top of the pile was a name that made her stomach churn. Samuel Hayes. Her eyes widened. Samuel Hayes. The Samuel Hayes, the powerful real estate mogul whose name dominated the city's skyline. She had seen his face on billboards, on the front page of newspapers. He was untouchable, a man who lived in a world light years away from hers. What were his documents doing here? She rifled through the papers, feeling like an intruder in someone else's life. Some of the contracts were for high-rise buildings she passed by, others hinted at deals worth millions. This was serious stuff. Sadie closed the briefcase slowly, her mind racing. This was an opportunity. She just didn't know what kind yet. Should she turn it in? Maybe there'd be a reward. But then again, what could she gain from a man like Samuel Hayes? A man who probably wouldn't even look at someone like her, let alone care about her problems. No, she whispered to herself, tightening her grip on the handle. This could be something more. Her thoughts circled back to her own past, the life she once had before she ended up on the streets. A life full of questions, like the one she had been asking herself for years. Who was her father? Her real father? She stood up, determination hardening in her chest. Maybe, just maybe, this briefcase could give her something she hadn't had in a long time. Leverage. Maybe Samuel Hayes had answers she could use to solve the mystery that had haunted her all these years. If she found him, she wouldn't hand the briefcase back for free. "I want to know who my father is," she murmured to the empty alleyway. And Samuel Hayes. Samuel Hayes was about to help her find out. As she slipped back into the shadows, the briefcase clutched tightly in her hand. Sadie knew one thing for sure. This was just the beginning. Sadie spent the entire night hidden away in a derelict corner of an abandoned warehouse, her mind racing as she stared at the briefcase. The old mattress beneath her smelled of mildew, but she was too focused to care. Her fingers drummed against her knees. She had to be careful. Approaching someone like Samuel Hayes wasn't something you did casually. She had no idea how the man would react. A reward, sure, but Sadie wanted more. She needed more. She had no family, no home, no answers. If this was going to work, it had to be about more than money. By morning, the light filtering through the shattered windows of the warehouse filled the room with a dull, gray glow. She knew what she had to do. Tracking down Samuel Hayes wasn't as hard as Sadie expected. The man's life was practically public property. Offices downtown, charity events at posh hotels, his mansion in the ritzy suburbs. She had it all mapped out in her head, a series of checkpoints that led to the core of his world. But she also knew she couldn't just walk into his office or show up at his doorstep. He'd never see her. So, she found the next best thing, his assistant. A week passed before Sadie finally caught sight of her target, a well-dressed woman with sharp heels and sharper eyes, stepping out of a gleaming black car in front of the Hayes Corporation building. Sadie stood across the street, watching her every move. The assistant, Erica, according to the plaque on her desk, was a gatekeeper. If Sadie could get past her, she might have a chance. Sadie straightened her jacket, took a deep breath, and crossed the street. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she approached, the briefcase feeling heavier with each step. "Excuse me," Sadie called out, her voice steadier than she felt. Erica glanced at her, already dismissing her as someone begging for change. Sadie saw the moment her eyes flickered with impatience. "I don't have time. It's about Samuel Hayes," Sadie interrupted, her words slicing through the air like a knife. That got her attention. Erica's brow arched, her gaze narrowing. "What about him?" "I found something of his, something important, and I need to talk to him about it." "It can't wait." Sadie held up the briefcase, making sure the assistant saw the engraved initials, S.H, glinting in the sunlight. Erica's eyes widened for a split second before her usual composure snapped back into place. "Where did you get that?" Erica's voice dropped, her eyes darting around, making sure no one else was watching. "I'll tell Samuel Hayes himself," Sadie replied, her voice calm but firm. "Not you. Just him." Erica looked torn for a moment, weighing the situation. The last thing she wanted was to let some street kid near her boss, but she couldn't ignore the briefcase. Not this time. With a sharp nod, she gestured toward the building. "Come with me." Sadie followed Erica into the towering building, her heart thundering as they walked through the sleek marble lobby. She felt out of place among the polished surfaces and expensive suits, but she kept her head high. She needed to look like she belonged, even if every inch of her screamed the opposite. They took an elevator up to the 30th floor, where Erica led her down a quiet corridor. The air felt heavier here, the kind of silence that told Sadie important decisions were made behind these doors. Erica stopped at a massive oak door with the name Samuel Hayes etched in gold lettering. "You wait here," Erica ordered, giving Sadie one last scrutinizing look before disappearing into the office. Sadie stood alone in the hallway, clutching the briefcase, her stomach twisting in knots. She had never been this close to someone so powerful, so far out of her world. For a moment, she considered bolting, running as far away as possible. But then she thought of the years she'd spent wondering who she was, where she came from, and how her life had spiraled into this mess. No, she had come too far to back out now. Minutes later, the door opened, and Erica reappeared, looking slightly frazzled. "He'll see you now." Sadie swallowed hard and stepped into the room. The office was enormous, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a sweeping view of the city. A massive desk dominated the space, and behind it sat Samuel Hayes. His presence was intimidating, his sharp suit and piercing blue eyes giving off the aura of a man who had the world at his feet. He looked up from the papers in front of him, his expression unreadable. "I hear you have something of mine," he said in a deep, commanding voice. Sadie nodded, feeling the weight of his gaze on her. She stepped forward and placed the briefcase on the desk, flipping it open to reveal the contents. For a moment, Samuel said nothing, his eyes scanning the documents inside. Then, slowly, he leaned back in his chair, studying her. "And what do you want?" he asked, his voice calm but laced with curiosity. "Money? A reward?" Sadie took a breath, steadying herself. "I don't want your money," she began, locking eyes with him. "I want you to help me find my father." For the first time, Samuel's cool composure faltered, a flicker of surprise crossing his face. He studied her for a long moment, as if trying to decipher her motives. "Your father?" he repeated, leaning forward slightly. "Why come to me with this?" "I've been looking for him for years," Sadie explained, her voice quieter now but still determined. "I don't know his name, where he is, or anything about him. But you have power, connections. You can help me." Samuel raised an eyebrow, intrigued but cautious. "And if I say no? Then I walk out of here, and this briefcase. Your business, your secrets, they all walk with me," Sadie said, her voice steady despite the pounding in her chest. Silence hung in the air for a few moments as Samuel stared at her, weighing her words. Finally, he leaned back in his chair, a slow smile creeping onto his face. "You're bold. I'll give you that," he said, amusement lacing his voice. "All right, Miss Harper," she said. "Sadie Harper." "Miss Harper," he continued, "I'll look into it. But understand this, what you're asking won't be easy. You're digging up the past, and sometimes the past is better left buried." "I don't care," Sadie replied firmly. "I need answers." Samuel nodded, his smile fading into a more serious expression. "Very well. I'll start making inquiries. But remember, the truth might not be what you're hoping for." Sadie didn't flinch. "I can handle it." As she walked out of the office, the weight of what she had done settled on her shoulders. She had set something in motion, something that couldn't be undone. Days passed, and Sadie found herself anxiously waiting for any word from Samuel Hayes. Each morning, she'd wake up with a new sense of urgency, checking the phone he had given her. The sleek, expensive device a stark contrast to her usual existence. But it remained silent, leaving her to wander the city, her thoughts constantly returning to the briefcase, to Samuel, and to the father she had never known. She had made a dangerous gamble, putting her fate in the hands of a man she barely knew. A man who lived in a world that had always been out of reach for her. And now, she had to wait, with nothing but her doubts and fears for company. It wasn't until the 5th day that the call finally came. Sadie was sitting in a small diner, nursing a cup of coffee she had barely touched. The bell above the door jingled as people came and went, but she barely noticed. Her mind was too occupied with the uncertainty of what would come next. The phone buzzed on the table, the sudden vibration pulling her out of her thoughts. Her heart raced as she saw the name flash across the screen. "Hayes' office." She answered immediately. "Sadie Harper." "Miss Harper, this is Samuel Hayes," came the familiar deep voice on the other end, calm as ever. "I found something. Meet me at my office in an hour." The line went dead before she could respond, leaving her heart pounding in anticipation. She quickly grabbed her jacket and hurried out of the diner, her thoughts racing faster than her feet. When Sadie arrived at Samuel's office, she was ushered in without hesitation. The same imposing oak door greeted her, but this time, there was no sense of hesitation. She had crossed a threshold the first time she entered, and now there was no turning back. Samuel was standing by the window, his back to her, looking out over the city skyline. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the room. He didn't turn around when she entered, but his voice carried across the space. "I've been digging into your past, as you requested," he began, his tone more serious than before. "What I found is not what I expected." Sadie's stomach clenched, but she forced herself to stay calm. "What do you mean?" Samuel finally turned to face her, his expression unreadable. "Your mother, Catherine Harper. She was more connected than I thought. She had ties to a man named Michael Donovan, a mid-level real estate player in the 90s. But that's not all." He paused, as if considering how much to reveal, and Sadie's patience wore thin. "Tell me." Samuel walked over to his desk and pulled out a slim folder, handing it to her. Michael Donovan disappeared about 15 years ago, under mysterious circumstances. His financial records were wiped clean, his assets transferred out of state, and no one's seen him since. Your mother's name is tied to him in several places, but it's buried, hidden in shell companies and fake names. Sadie's fingers trembled as she opened the folder. Inside were pictures, documents, and names she didn't recognize. But one picture stood out, a grainy photo of her mother, much younger, standing beside a man she assumed was Donovan. Her mother had never told her about him. Why would my mother hide this? Sadie whispered, more to herself than to Samuel. Samuel leaned back in his chair, watching her carefully. That's the real question, isn't it? I don't know what happened between your mother and Donovan, but it's clear she didn't want anyone knowing about it. Whatever she was involved in, it was big enough to make people disappear. Sadie looked up from the file, a knot of confusion tightening in her chest. So, what does this have to do with my father? Samuel hesitated, then tapped his fingers lightly on the desk. I don't know, but I've reached out to some contacts. If Donovan's still alive, someone knows where he is. He might have the answers you're looking for. Sadie's mind spun. Donovan, a name she'd never heard, a ghost from her mother's past. The idea that he could somehow be connected to her father, or to her mother's disappearance, sent a chill down her spine. And if he's not alive? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. Samuel's gaze didn't waver. Then we'll find out who buried him. The weight of what Samuel had uncovered hung heavily on Sadie as she left his office that evening. The air was cool, the sky a mix of deep purples and reds as night fell over the city, but she barely noticed. Her thoughts were consumed by the new information, by the pieces of a puzzle she didn't yet know how to solve. Her mother had kept so many secrets from her, secrets that might have led to the very life Sadie was living now. But what scared her most was the thought that her father had been just another one of those secrets, a man whose face she couldn't picture, whose name she had never spoken, and whose existence was now tangled up with a man like Michael Donovan. As she wandered through the streets, Sadie couldn't shake the feeling that she was getting closer to something dangerous. The more she dug, the more she risked uncovering things that could change her life forever. But she couldn't stop now, not after coming this far. She had to know the truth. Sadie had barely slept in days. The anxiety gnawed at her insides as she lay on the thin mattress in her rundown room. The lead on Michael Donovan stirred something in her, something dark. She was closer to finding out the truth about her father, but the more Samuel uncovered, the more tangled the web became. Why had her mother hidden all this from her? Why had her life become a puzzle made of secrets, half-truths, and shadows? The phone buzzed on the crate she used as a bedside table. She flinched, grabbing it quickly. It was a text from Samuel. I found something. Meet me at the hotel. It's urgent. Sadie's heart skipped. There was no time to waste. She threw on her jacket and bolted out the door. Samuel had chosen a hotel, one of those sleek, anonymous places in the middle of downtown, for their meeting. It was the kind of place where deals were made, where people with power came to hide or handle things quietly. Sadie had only been in places like this a few times, but never as a guest. She walked quickly through the lobby, her eyes darting around as if the answers she sought might be lurking in the corners. The elevator ride felt like it took forever, the soft music doing nothing to calm her nerves. Finally, the doors slid open on the top floor, and there was Samuel, standing at the end of the hallway, waiting. You came quickly, he said, nodding in approval. There was something different in his expression today. Something serious, even more so than usual. You said it was urgent, Sadie replied, trying to steady her breath. What did you find? Samuel didn't respond immediately. Instead, he motioned for her to follow him into the room. The moment she stepped inside, she felt the weight of the tension. The curtains were drawn, blocking out the city lights, and on the table lay several documents, photos, and a laptop. You're not going to like what I'm about to tell you, Samuel said, his tone low and careful. Sadie's stomach churned. Just say it. He gestured to a chair, but Sadie shook her head, too anxious to sit. Samuel didn't push it. He picked up one of the folders, flipping it open to reveal an old birth certificate. Her name was there, Sadie Harper, along with her mother's name, but something was missing. Under the section for the father's name, the space was left blank. "I've been looking into your mother's past," Samuel began, his voice calm but deliberate. "But this came as a shock, even to me. The man we've been chasing, Michael Donovan, he's not your father." Sadie felt a jolt of confusion, her mind racing. Then why is my mother connected to him? Why hide it all? Samuel sighed deeply, rubbing his temples as if the weight of the truth was too much even for him. "Because she didn't want anyone to know the truth about who your father really is." He reached over to the laptop and tapped a few keys. The screen lit up, revealing an image of a much younger Samuel Hayes, smiling at the camera. Beside him was a woman, her hair long and dark, her eyes filled with warmth. Sadie felt her knees weaken. It was her mother. Sadie stared at the image, her mind struggling to process what she was seeing. That's my mom." Samuel's expression softened, but the tension in the room grew unbearable. "Sadie, your mother was Catherine Harper. She and I were together a long time ago. What I didn't know until now was that—" He hesitated, then forced the words out, "You're my daughter." For a moment, the world stopped. Sadie's breath caught in her throat, her vision narrowing until all she could see was Samuel's face. His words echoed in her mind, refusing to settle into place. "You're my daughter." "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "That can't be true. That can't be." Samuel stepped forward, his voice gentle but firm. "It's true. Your mother never told me. I thought you died when you were just a baby." Sadie's chest tightened, her thoughts spiraling. Why would she do that? Why would she tell you I was dead? Her voice cracked, the words barely audible. "She was trying to protect you. From me. From my world." Samuel's jaw clenched, his frustration barely contained. "I wasn't a good man back then, Sadie. Your mother and I, we were caught up in things. Deals. Dangerous people. When she left, I didn't try to stop her because I thought you were gone. I had no reason to keep fighting." Sadie stumbled backward, her hand instinctively reaching for the back of a chair to steady herself. She wanted to scream, to deny everything he was saying, but the look in Samuel's eyes told her it was all true. Her whole life had been a lie. The man who had abandoned her, the man she had dreamed of finding, he had been right in front of her the whole time. "You knew," she said, her voice shaking. "You knew my mother. And you just— what? Let her disappear? You didn't try to find her?" Samuel's face twisted with regret. "I didn't know, Sadie. I swear. If I had known you were alive, I never would have stopped looking." Anger and confusion clashed inside her. How could her mother have kept this from her? How could this man, standing here in front of her, have been so close yet so far away all her life? "Why now?" she demanded, her voice rising. "Why tell me now, after all these years?" "Because I didn't know," Samuel said softly, his voice full of an emotion Sadie had never seen in him before. "I didn't know until I started digging into your past, until I found the birth certificate, the connections. I swear to you, if I had known, I would have—" "What?" Sadie cut him off, tears welling in her eyes. "You would have what? Saved me from the streets? Brought me into your perfect life? It's too late for that." Samuel didn't flinch at her words, but the pain in his eyes was evident. "It's not too late, Sadie. I want to help you now. I want to make things right." She laughed bitterly, wiping at her eyes. "Right? How do you make this right?" Silence fell between them, thick and heavy. Sadie turned her back to him, staring blankly at the window. The city stretched out beneath her, alive with 1,000 lives that weren't hers, 1,000 people who didn't carry the weight of these revelations on their shoulders. The man she had been searching for wasn't some mystery hidden in the past. He had been hiding in plain sight. And now that she knew, everything felt even more uncertain than before. "I don't know if I can do this," Sadie whispered, her voice barely audible. Samuel took a step closer, his presence somehow comforting despite everything. "I know this is overwhelming, but I'm here now. We'll figure this out together. You're not alone anymore." Sadie wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe that everything could change, that this new truth could offer her a future. But part of her still felt betrayed. still felt the sting of abandonment that had followed her all her life. "I need time," she said finally, her voice quiet but firm. "I need to think." Samuel nodded, his expression filled with a sadness that mirrored her own. "Take all the time you need." As Sadie left the hotel room, the weight of the revelation hung heavy on her shoulders. Samuel Hayes was her father. The truth she had spent her life searching for had finally been uncovered, but it wasn't the relief she had imagined. It was a whole new kind of burden, one she wasn't sure she was ready to carry. But there was no going back now. The truth had found her, and it was only the beginning. The cold autumn wind bit at Sadie's skin as she wandered aimlessly through the streets. She didn't know where she was going. She just needed to move. The weight of Samuel's revelation followed her like a shadow, its presence suffocating. "He's my father." The words echoed in her mind, but they felt alien, detached from reality. How could this man, the one who had sat behind that desk like an impenetrable wall of power and wealth, be the father she had never known? Sadie stopped near a park bench and sat down, pulling her jacket tighter around her. She watched as children played nearby, laughing and chasing each other, their voices carried away by the wind. Their carefree joy felt like a world she no longer belonged to, a distant memory from a childhood she barely remembered. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, but she didn't look at it right away. She knew who it was. Samuel had been texting her since she left the hotel. He was trying, she could see that, but she didn't know if she was ready. How do you suddenly connect with someone who's been a ghost in your life? After a few minutes, curiosity got the better of her. She pulled out the phone and glanced at the screen. "Samuel Hayes, can we talk? I want to see you. Please." Sadie stared at the message for a long time, her thumb hovering over the reply button. She couldn't avoid him forever. Not now. Not with everything that had come to light. With a heavy sigh, she typed a quick response. "Where?" An hour later, Sadie stood outside a small cafe tucked away in a quiet corner of the city. It wasn't one of the flashy, high-end places she had expected Samuel to suggest. Instead, it was a simple, cozy spot, the kind of place where regular people went to escape the noise of the city. She wondered if he had chosen it for her sake, to make things feel less intimidating. She stepped inside, scanning the room. Samuel was sitting at a corner table, looking completely out of place in his tailored suit. His gaze locked onto hers as soon as she walked in, and for a moment, they both froze, unsure of how to proceed. The reality of their connection still felt like an unsteady bridge neither of them knew how to cross. Sadie approached the table slowly, her heart racing. Samuel stood up as she neared, offering an awkward, hesitant smile. "Thank you for coming," he said softly, pulling out a chair for her. Sadie sat down, glancing around the cafe. The smell of coffee and baked goods filled the air, but her appetite was non-existent. "I wasn't sure if I would," she admitted. "I'm glad you did." Samuel sat across from her, his hands folded on the table, his gaze searching her face for any sign of what she was thinking. "I know this is a lot." Sadie let out a bitter laugh. "Yeah, you could say that." There was a heavy silence between them. For a man who commanded boardrooms and handled multimillion-dollar deals with ease, Samuel suddenly looked unsure, almost vulnerable. It was strange to see someone like him so human. "I don't expect you to forgive me," Samuel said, his voice quiet but steady. "I don't expect anything, honestly, but I want you to know that I'm here now. I want to be here for you, if you'll let me." Sadie's fingers traced the edge of the table, her mind spinning with 1,000 thoughts. "I don't know what to think or how to feel," she said, her voice wavering. "For years, I thought my father was some guy who didn't want me. Now you're telling me you didn't even know I was alive." "I didn't," Samuel said, his tone full of regret. "Your mother, she was trying to protect you. From me, from the life I was living. She thought it was the only way." Sadie's eyes met his, searching for any trace of dishonesty, but she found none. There was only a sadness that mirrored her own. "But why didn't you look for her? Why didn't you try to find out what happened?" Samuel leaned back slightly, running a hand through his hair. I thought I had lost you both. After she left, I was a different man. I buried myself in my work, in building my empire. I told myself it was better to move on, But the truth is, I was running from the pain. I didn't want to face the loss. Sadie clenched her fists under the table, fighting the surge of anger and confusion swirling inside her. Do you know what it's like growing up without knowing who you are? Wondering every day why your own father didn't care enough to stay. I spent my whole life thinking I wasn't good enough, that I wasn't worth finding. Samuel flinched at her words, his expression pained. I can't undo what's been done, he said quietly, but I can be here now. I want to know you, Sadie. I want to be the father you deserved. Sadie's eyes filled with tears, but she quickly blinked them away. She didn't want to cry in front of him, not after everything. She had spent years being tough, surviving on her own. She wasn't ready to let that wall crumble. I don't know if I can just switch like that, she whispered. I don't know if I can trust you. Samuel nodded, understanding. I don't expect it to be easy, but I'm willing to try. I'll wait as long as it takes. Sadie looked down at her hands, her mind a whirlwind of emotions. She had spent so long searching for her father, dreaming of what it would be like to find him. But this wasn't the fairy tale reunion she had imagined. It was messy, complicated, and full of unresolved pain. Still, there was a part of her that wanted to believe Samuel, a part of her that wanted to give him a chance, despite everything. She took a deep breath, steeling herself for what came next. I need time, she said, her voice soft but firm. I don't know how to do this. I don't know how to let you in. Samuel nodded again, his eyes full of understanding. Take all the time you need. I'll be here. And when you're ready, we'll figure this out together. For the first time since she had met him, Sadie saw something real in Samuel's eyes, something she hadn't expected. It wasn't pity or guilt. It was hope. I'll try, she said quietly, the words feeling both terrifying and freeing at the same time. Samuel smiled, a small, tentative smile that seemed to carry the weight of 1,000 unspoken apologies. That's all I'm asking. The conversation hung in the air between them, fragile but not broken. It was the beginning of something new, something neither of them fully understood. As they sat in that cafe, surrounded by the hum of everyday life, Sadie felt the smallest flicker of possibility, a chance for something she hadn't dared to believe in for years. Maybe, just maybe, she could find a way to reconnect with the father she never knew. But deep down, Sadie knew it wouldn't be that simple. The past had a way of creeping back in, and the secrets her mother had kept weren't buried as deep as she'd hoped. The weeks after Samuel's revelation were a strange mix of tension and cautious hope for Sadie. She and Samuel were trying, but it was a slow and fragile process. They met regularly, usually in quiet places where they wouldn't be noticed, small cafes or isolated parks. The conversations were tentative, with both of them carefully navigating this new reality. Samuel, a man used to control and power, seemed almost unsure of himself when it came to something as personal as fatherhood. Sadie, meanwhile, struggled with her own doubts. How could she trust him after so many years of living without knowing who he really was? Still, they made progress. In those quiet moments, she began to see glimpses of who Samuel really was beyond the cold businessman. There was a softness in his eyes when he talked about her mother, a vulnerability he rarely showed. She found herself wanting to believe that they could build something real, something that resembled a family, though she wasn't quite ready to call it that yet. But underneath it all, there was a lingering unease. Something felt unfinished. One afternoon, after meeting with Samuel, Sadie decided to take a walk through the park. It had become a routine of sorts, a way to clear her head after their meetings. The cool breeze and rustling leaves usually gave her a sense of calm, but today felt different. As she walked, something caught her attention. A black sedan parked across the street. It had been there when she arrived, and it was still there now, almost an hour later. She couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching her. Sadie's instincts, honed by years of living on the streets, kicked in. She kept her eyes forward, but her body tensed. The car was too still, too fixed on her. Her pulse quickened as she took a sharp turn, ducking into a quieter street. She didn't want to overreact, but everything inside her was screaming that something wasn't right. She kept walking, her pace quickening as she tried to shake the unsettling feeling. Her heart pounded in her chest, and she glanced over her shoulder. Nothing. The street was empty, the black car no longer in sight. But the unease didn't fade. Samuel had warned her, briefly, that his world wasn't safe. That there were people from his past who might not be pleased with the idea of him reconnecting with her. At the time, she hadn't fully understood the weight of that warning. She had figured it was more about his personal regrets and business dealings than any real threat. But now, as the air around her seemed to grow colder, Sadie wondered if she had been too naive. That night, in the small, dingy room she called home, Sadie tried to focus on anything else. She sat on the edge of her bed, flipping through old magazines she'd picked up at a secondhand store. But her mind kept wandering back to the car. She couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been following her, and the thought made her restless. Her phone buzzed on the nightstand, pulling her out of her thoughts. She picked it up, half expecting it to be Samuel, checking in as he had started to do. But the number on the screen wasn't his. It was an unknown number, and her heart skipped a beat. For a moment, she hesitated. Every instinct told her not to answer. She had learned long ago that unknown numbers rarely brought good news. But something else, a gut feeling, perhaps, compelled her to swipe the screen and bring the phone to her ear. "Hello?" Her voice was steady, but her hand gripped the phone tightly. There was a pause on the other end, just long enough to make her nerves buzz with anxiety. Then, a voice spoke, low and calm. "Miss Harper, you need to be careful." Sadie's blood ran cold. "Who is this?" "That's not important," the voice replied, still calm, almost too calm. "But what is important is that people are watching. You've drawn attention to yourself by being around Samuel Hayes. You need to understand. There are people who don't want this reunion to happen." Sadie's breath caught in her throat. She had expected something like this, maybe, but hearing it spoken aloud made it all too real. "What do you want?" "I don't want anything," the voice said smoothly. "I'm just delivering a message. Stay away from Samuel. If you keep digging into the past, you'll find things you won't like. And more than that, you'll put yourself in danger." A chill ran down her spine. "Is that a threat?" "It's a warning," the voice replied, unbothered by her defiance. "Take it seriously, Miss Harper. Some things are better left alone." Before Sadie could respond, the line went dead. She sat there in silence, the phone still pressed to her ear, her heart racing. The fear that had been creeping in all day now felt like a tangible presence in the room. Whoever that was, they knew who she was, where she was, and more terrifyingly, they knew about her connection to Samuel. The past Samuel had hinted at was no longer some abstract idea. It was real, and it was closing in on her. The next morning, Sadie went to see Samuel. She didn't want to admit she was scared, but the phone call had shaken her more than she cared to admit. She found him in his office, pacing near the window, looking more troubled than she had ever seen him. It wasn't the confident, controlled man she had gotten used to. "Samuel," she said as she stepped inside, her voice sharper than usual. "We need to talk." He turned to face her, his expression dark. "I know. I've been meaning to call you." Sadie crossed her arms, her frustration bubbling to the surface. "Who's after us? Who's watching?" Samuel's jaw tightened, and for a moment, he looked away, as if debating how much to tell her. "I didn't want you to get pulled into this, Sadie, but there are people who benefited from your mother's disappearance, and they don't want me digging into it. They don't want us finding out the truth." Sadie's heart sank. Who? Who are these people?" "They're powerful," Samuel said grimly. "Old associates, people who profited when I stepped away from certain deals years ago. They've kept themselves hidden, but now that I'm looking into your past, into what really happened to your mother, they see it as a threat. To them, you're a loose end. They'll do whatever it takes to protect themselves." Sadie felt a knot form in her stomach. "So they want me gone?" "They want both of us gone," Samuel said quietly, stepping closer. "But I'm not going to let that happen. I promise you, Sadie, I'll protect you." She wanted to believe him, but the weight of the danger pressing in on them felt too real. The peaceful, tentative steps they had taken toward rebuilding their relationship now seemed insignificant compared to the storm looming over them. Sadie stood there in silence, staring at the man who was her father, a man who had unknowingly led her into a web of secrets and enemies. She knew then that there was no turning back. Whatever they had started, it was far from over. The air inside Samuel's office felt heavy, thick with the weight of what they had just discussed. Sadie stood there, still trying to process the enormity of the situation. People, dangerous, powerful people, wanted them gone. The realization sat like a stone in her stomach. She had spent her life fighting to survive on the streets, but this was different. This wasn't about hunger or finding a place to sleep. This was about staying alive. Samuel had tried to reassure her, promising protection, but Sadie wasn't convinced. The world he lived in was one she didn't fully understand, but it was clearly full of shadows and threats that could reach them both. She felt trapped, like a target painted on her back was becoming clearer with every passing hour. "We can't stay here," Samuel said suddenly, breaking the tense silence. Sadie looked at him, surprised. "What do you mean?" "We need to move, go somewhere safe," he explained, his voice firm. "I have a property outside the city, secluded, secure. We'll have time to think, plan our next move." The urgency in his tone was unmistakable, and Sadie felt her chest tighten. "Are we really running? Like, for real? Running from these people?" Samuel met her gaze, his expression serious. "It's not running, Sadie. It's surviving. Until we know who exactly is behind this and what they're willing to do, we need to be smart. And right now, that means getting out of sight." She nodded slowly, the gravity of the situation sinking in. This wasn't just some bad dream. It was real, and it was happening fast. "Okay, but how do we even know it's safe? They've been following us, watching us. They'll know where you are, won't they?" Samuel hesitated for a second, his eyes narrowing. "I've taken precautions. The house I'm talking about isn't tied directly to my name. It's a place I kept off the radar for situations like this." Sadie's mind was racing. Situations like this? How many times had Samuel been in danger like this before? How deep did his past go? She wanted to ask, but there was no time for those questions now. They had to move. "Fine," she said, her voice steady despite the panic swirling inside her. "Let's go." That evening, they left the city. Samuel had arranged for a car to pick them up, an unmarked, nondescript sedan that blended in with the evening traffic. Sadie sat in the back seat, her eyes scanning the roads and side streets as they drove. Every shadow, every passing car made her nervous. She half expected someone to jump out at them, to ambush the vehicle at any moment. But the drive was quiet, almost eerily so. Samuel sat next to her, calm but alert. His phone buzzed every so often, and each time, he glanced at it quickly, typing back short, decisive responses. Sadie assumed he was coordinating something, perhaps with security or with whoever he trusted to handle the threat they were facing. But she didn't ask. She was too lost in her own thoughts, the weight of everything pressing down on her like a vice. After what felt like hours, they pulled off the main road onto a winding dirt path that led through a thick forest. The trees closed in around them, the headlights cutting through the darkness like knives. The house appeared suddenly at the end of the road, a large, dark silhouette against the night sky. It was modern, yet isolated, tucked away from the world. "This is it," Samuel said, breaking the silence as the car came to a stop. Sadie stepped out into the cold air, pulling her jacket tight around her. The house loomed before them, its windows dark and reflective, revealing nothing of what lay inside. It looked like a fortress, secure, safe, at least for now. Samuel led her inside, and Sadie was immediately struck by the stark contrast to the world outside. The interior was sleek, minimalistic. Everything seemed carefully chosen, perfectly placed, but it felt empty, lifeless, like a place that was meant to hide people, not live in. "Come on," Samuel said, motioning for her to follow him through the hallway. "We'll stay in the back rooms. I've got security cameras around the perimeter, and there's a panic room if things get bad." Sadie followed silently, her footsteps soft against the polished floors. The unease in her chest hadn't gone away. If anything, it had grown stronger. This place, while secure, felt like a cage. "How long do you think we'll have to stay here?" she asked, her voice betraying the nerves she was trying to suppress. "Until I'm sure it's safe," Samuel replied, glancing at her. "I've got people looking into who's behind this. I'll know more soon. But until then, we need to keep our heads down. Sadie nodded, trying to focus on the present. But her thoughts kept drifting back to that phone call, the voice that had warned her to stay away. The voice that had made it clear there were forces at play that neither she nor Samuel fully understood. That night, Sadie found herself unable to sleep. She lay on the large bed in the guest room, staring at the ceiling as her mind replayed the events of the past few days. Everything had changed so quickly. One moment, she was just a girl searching for her father, and the next, she was on the run from people she didn't even know. Samuel had said he would protect her, but Sadie wasn't sure if he fully understood the danger. Maybe he thought he could handle it, like he handled everything else in his life, with money, power, and influence. But these enemies weren't like the business rivals he was used to. These were people willing to kill to protect their secrets. At some point, in the early hours of the morning, Sadie drifted into a restless sleep. A sudden noise jolted her awake. She sat up in bed, her heart pounding, listening intently. The house was dark and quiet, but something had disturbed her. A creak, maybe, or the sound of something outside. She slipped out of bed, moving quietly to the window, peeking through the heavy curtains. At first, she saw nothing, just the trees swaying in the wind, the faint glow of the security lights outside. But then, there it was, a figure moving just beyond the edge of the trees. Her breath caught in her throat as she watched it disappear behind the shadows. Her first instinct was to run, to wake Samuel, but she hesitated. What if she was wrong? What if it was just an animal or her imagination playing tricks on her? But then she heard the noise again, closer this time. A faint rustling, like someone, or something, was trying to get closer to the house. Panic surged through her. She ran to the door, threw it open, and rushed down the hallway toward Samuel's room. She pounded on the door, her voice barely above a whisper, but filled with urgency. Samuel, someone's outside. He was up in seconds, his eyes sharp and focused. He grabbed his phone, checking the security cameras from a small monitor mounted on the wall. His expression darkened as he scanned the footage. "Stay here," he said, his voice calm but commanding. "I'm going to check the perimeter." Sadie shook her head. "You're not going out there alone. What if it's them? What if they found us?" Samuel's jaw clenched. "That's exactly why I need to go. To make sure they don't get inside." Fear tightened its grip on Sadie, but she knew there was no stopping him. Samuel was already moving toward the door, his face set with determination. She stood frozen for a moment, then grabbed her jacket and followed him out. Whatever was coming for them, they were going to face it together. Sadie's heart raced as she followed Samuel through the dark, silent corridors of the house. The cold air outside bit at her skin as they stepped onto the porch, the trees surrounding the property swaying ominously in the wind. She scanned the area, her eyes darting between the shadows, every muscle in her body tense. Samuel moved with purpose, checking the perimeter of the house with swift, practiced motions. He had taken a small flashlight from inside, its narrow beam cutting through the dark as they walked toward the edge of the woods where Sadie had seen the figure. The security lights cast long shadows across the ground, and every gust of wind made the branches rustle, feeding her growing paranoia. "Stay close," Samuel whispered, his voice low but firm. Sadie nodded, her hands stuffed deep into the pockets of her jacket, gripping her phone tightly. She wasn't sure what to expect, if the figure she had seen was just a random passerby or something far more dangerous. The silence around them felt oppressive, broken only by the sound of their footsteps crunching on the gravel. They approached the tree line, where the shadows grew darker and the air colder. Sadie's heart thudded in her chest as she peered into the woods. The trees seemed to swallow the faint light from the house, making it impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. "I saw someone here," Sadie murmured, pointing toward the trees. They were moving, watching. Samuel turned toward the direction she indicated, his face grim. He swept the flashlight's beam over the area, but the light revealed nothing but swaying branches and dense foliage. "Could be someone scouting the place," Samuel muttered under his breath. "Or worse, we can't take any chances." As he moved forward to inspect the area more closely, Sadie hesitated. Every instinct told her to turn back, to run inside and lock the doors, but something deeper, something more stubborn, kept her rooted in place. She wasn't just scared, she was angry. Angry at being hunted, angry at the secrets that had put them both in danger. She had spent her whole life running, and now that she had found some sense of answers, it felt like it was all slipping away again. Samuel stepped ahead, crouching to examine the ground. His flashlight flickered across a patch of disturbed earth, and Sadie saw his posture stiffen. He motioned for her to come closer. "There," he said quietly, pointing at a set of faint footprints in the mud. They led deeper into the woods, disappearing into the shadows. Sadie's stomach tightened. They were here. Before either of them could react, a sudden crack echoed through the trees, like a branch snapping under the weight of something heavy. Sadie's pulse spiked, and she instinctively stepped back, her breath catching in her throat. Samuel shot up, turning toward the sound, his hand gripping the flashlight so tightly his knuckles turned white. "Get inside," Samuel ordered, his voice sharp. But before they could retreat, a figure emerged from the darkness, stepping into the faint glow of the flashlight's beam. Sadie's breath hitched as she saw the man, tall, dressed in dark clothes, his face half covered by a hood. His eyes, sharp and cold, locked onto them with unsettling calm. Neither Sadie nor Samuel moved for what felt like an eternity, the tension hanging between them like a loaded gun. The man spoke first, his voice low and deliberate. "You're making a mistake, Hayes." Samuel's body tensed, and his hand twitched toward his phone, as if debating whether to call for help or handle the situation himself. "Who sent you?" he demanded, his voice steady, though Sadie could hear the strain behind it. The man tilted his head slightly, almost as if amused. "You already know. You've been digging too deep, asking the wrong questions. They don't want the truth coming out, and neither should you." Sadie felt a cold wave of fear wash over her. She knew now, this man wasn't just a threat. He was a message, a warning. The phone call from before had been a mere introduction to the real danger, and now it was standing right in front of them. Samuel didn't flinch. "I'm not backing down. You can tell whoever sent you that." The man chuckled softly, his expression darkening. "You think you can win this? You think you can protect her?" His eyes flickered toward Sadie, and a shiver ran down her spine. "She's part of the reason they're after you. Hayes, you're digging into the wrong past." Sadie's chest tightened, and she took a step forward, her voice coming out stronger than she felt. "What do you mean? What does this have to do with me?" The man didn't answer right away. He seemed to enjoy watching their confusion, their fear. "Your mother was involved in more than you realize, girl," he said slowly. "Her disappearance, her ties to Donovan. There's a lot more at stake than you know. And if you keep pushing, you'll end up just like her." Sadie's heart stopped. The mention of her mother's name sent a jolt through her, like a sudden shock to the system. This man, this whole situation, was tied to the truth she had been searching for. But now, it was clear that finding that truth was far more dangerous than she had ever imagined. Samuel stepped in front of her, blocking the man's view. "You're wasting your time," he said coldly. "Tell them we're not stopping, no matter what." The man's smile faded, and for a moment, his eyes narrowed, a dangerous glint in them. "You've been warned," he said quietly. "Next time, there won't be any warnings." With that, the man stepped back into the darkness, disappearing into the trees as swiftly as he had appeared. The silence that followed felt suffocating, like the air had been sucked out of the world. Sadie stood frozen, her mind racing. The man's words echoed in her head, each one more terrifying than the last. "Your mother was involved in more than you realize." Samuel turned to her, his face grim. "We need to figure this out. Fast." Sadie nodded, her throat tight. What did he mean about my mom? About Donovan? Samuel's expression darkened further. "I don't know, but whatever it is, it's bigger than we thought. And it's not just about us. It's about what happened to your mother." Sadie swallowed hard, the weight of the truth pressing down on her. The answers she had been chasing her whole life were now tangled in a web of danger, and every step closer they took seemed to pull them deeper into something far more deadly than they had imagined. As they headed back inside, Sadie knew one thing for sure. The truth was out there, but finding it was going to cost them more than she had ever bargained for. And this time, running wasn't an option. They were in the middle of something they couldn't escape. The days that followed the confrontation were tense, each moment thick with anticipation as Sadie and Samuel tried to piece together the final threads of the mystery that had been pulling them deeper into a web of danger. The man's words haunted them both, especially Sadie. Every time she thought of her mother, of what she might have been involved in, her mind raced with questions that she was desperate to answer. But time was running out. Whoever was behind this was watching, waiting for the perfect moment to strike again. Samuel had reached out to his most trusted contacts, people who worked in the shadows, digging into old records, pulling strings, and following leads that had long been buried. Together, they had uncovered fragments of a larger picture, pieces that led to a conspiracy stretching back decades, one that involved her mother, Donovan, and a series of shady deals that had gone wrong. But it was one final lead that changed everything. The breakthrough came late one night when Samuel's phone buzzed with a message. His contact had found something, a key piece of information that connected Donovan to a powerful group of investors who had profited from illegal real estate deals. These deals had been covered up, and anyone who got too close, like Sadie's mother, had been quietly removed. Sadie sat across from Samuel in the dimly lit room, her heart pounding as he read the message aloud. The truth was finally within reach, but it was darker and more complicated than she had ever imagined. "Your mother wasn't just caught in Donovan's web," Samuel explained, his voice steady but heavy. "She knew too much. She tried to expose the group, to take them down. But when she got too close, they made her disappear." Sadie's throat tightened. "And Donovan? What happened to him?" Samuel's jaw clenched. "He vanished the same way. The group turned on him when they thought he was a liability. They covered it all up, made sure no one would connect the dots. But now we have enough to bring them down." It all clicked into place. The secrecy, the fear, the danger that had followed them. Sadie's mother had been brave, trying to bring justice to a world filled with corruption. But the people she had trusted had betrayed her, silencing her before she could expose them. "She was trying to protect me," Sadie said softly, her voice breaking. "She didn't tell me anything because she knew what would happen if I got involved." Samuel nodded, his eyes full of regret. "She did everything she could to keep you safe. And now, we're going to finish what she started." The weight of those words settled between them. For the first time in her life, Sadie felt like she understood the full scope of what had happened to her family. The truth had cost her mother everything, and now it was up to her and Samuel to make sure that justice was finally served. The next morning, they made their move. With the information Samuel had gathered, they contacted the authorities, but not just anyone. People Samuel trusted, who weren't tied to the corrupt network that had been protecting the group for so long. It was risky, but it was the only way. The evidence they had collected was undeniable, and the wheels of justice began to turn. Sadie could feel the tension in the air as they waited. Samuel's house had become their command center, with security watching the perimeter and every move being carefully coordinated. They knew the group would retaliate, that the danger wasn't over yet. But this time, they were ready. When the news broke, it sent shockwaves through the city. The real estate group, once thought untouchable, was finally exposed. High-profile arrests followed, and the story dominated the headlines for weeks. Donovan's name resurfaced, linked to a series of illegal deals, but it was her mother's story that took center stage. A brave woman who had tried to fight back against powerful enemies and had paid the ultimate price. For the first time in years, Sadie felt a sense of closure. The truth, as painful as it was, had finally come to light. A few weeks later, Sadie found herself standing at her mother's grave. The cemetery was quiet, the trees rustling softly in the breeze. She had come alone, needing a moment to herself, to say the things she had never had the chance to say. "I understand now," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I know what you were trying to do, why you kept it all from me. You were trying to protect me, even if it meant losing everything. And I'm sorry it took me so long to figure it out." Sadie wiped away a tear, her heart full of conflicting emotions, grief, anger, but also a sense of peace. She had spent so many years searching for answers, for some sense of who she was and where she came from. Now, She finally had those answers, and while they weren't what she had expected, they were the truth. As she stood there, she realized that she wasn't alone in this anymore. Samuel had been by her side, and though their relationship was still fragile, it was real. He wasn't the distant figure she had imagined, but a man who had his own regrets, his own mistakes. Together, they had faced the shadows of the past, and in doing so, had forged a bond that was stronger than either of them had expected. Later that evening, Sadie returned to the house where Samuel was waiting. He looked up as she entered, his eyes filled with a quiet understanding. "How are you feeling?" he asked, his voice gentle. Sadie smiled, a genuine, soft smile that felt new but right. "Better. I think I'm ready to move forward now." Samuel nodded, a sense of relief washing over him. "I'm glad to hear that. We've been through a lot." She walked over and sat beside him, the weight of the past finally lifting. "Yeah, we have. But I think we can make this work. We've got a lot to figure out, but I'm not running anymore." Samuel smiled, the warmth in his eyes unmistakable. "Neither am I." And for the first time, Sadie felt like she wasn't just running from her past, but stepping into a future she could finally embrace. Together, they had faced the darkness, and together, they would move towards something new. A fresh start, a new beginning.